Let's get into the next team. Let's get into the Cincinnati Bengals because I think this is a completely different story. Now, I like Joey B, but at the same time, they just made it to the Super Bowl. They're coming off it. They're in a very difficult division. They're in the AFC, which is a super, super stacked conference. They're, last year they benefited. They didn't have to play against the number one seeds. Now they have to go up against the number one seeds in the AFC this year. They got to go up against, they got to go with the Chiefs. They got to go with the Bills. They got to go with, I believe it was the Tennessee Titans. And the Tennessee Titans will now have a healthy Derrick Henry. Very different than a first game return from an injury, a Jones fracture, I believe, Derrick Henry. So it's going to be a much more difficult road for them schedule-wise. They also are playing against the AFC East as their opponent, which, lucky it's not the AFC West, but you're still playing Belichick. You're still playing against, even the Dolphins, they're much improved. So tough schedule. And also the roster, it's good. They have good players, but this is very different from the Rams roster where you're looking at it and you're like, this is clearly a top tier roster. It's like, okay, you got Joe Burrow. You got a good safety. You've got Jamar Chase. You got a great, weapons core. The offensive line isn't amazing. It's not as bad as it was a couple years ago, but I'm worried about this. Actually, I'm a Ravens fan. I would love for them to fail, but I'm worried about this team potentially having a Super Bowl hangover. What about you?
So I think you look at Super Bowl hangovers, and a lot of times it's actually a team that loses the Super Bowl that ends up really having that hangover. And I guess it's kind of weird because they didn't win the Super Bowl, right? You would think that it'd be the winner, but the loser makes the playoffs less than 70% of the time the next season, which if you're talking about a team being in the Super Bowl, that's not very high. And when I look at the Bengals roster, I don't know like how similar we feel, but I definitely do think that there's a legit case to be a little bit concerned about the Bengals being able to make the Super Bowl again this year. I think that's super fair. I think that their defense, they played well towards the end of the season, but their defensive personnel is not that great. Like, they got Jesse Bates, Trey Hendrickson are their two best players. Like, you look at most of the other playoff teams, you look at most of the other like top teams in the AFC, and they have better, star defensive players. And a lot of them have more depth overall, like throughout their whole team. Now, then you have to add in. You got Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Joe Mixon, Tyler Boyd, and quite a bit of an improved offensive line over the past couple years. That's nasty offense. So they could totally just come out and Jamar Chase. I mean, I think Jamar Chase might be the best receiver in the league in terms of physical traits. I don't know if he's quite there in terms of route running and stuff like that over, guys like Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams. But like in terms of traits, he's probably the best. I really like their players. I really like Joe Burrow, but like it seems like they kind of ran into ran into the Super Bowl, but they didn't have like the toughest schedule to go through the AFC last year in the playoffs. They got to play, and they did beat the Chiefs. That was a huge one. But they played the Raiders and the Titans, and Ryan Tannehill had like the worst game of his career. So it's tough when you look back on it. And it's not like it's like lucky or anything like that. Of course not. I mean, they played really well. They had some big time clutch field goals. And Joe Burrow had some clutch drives as well. Jamar Chase, like I said, their offense is insane. But I think it might come back down to earth a little bit. I think that you brought up that they play against the first place teams. The other thing is the Ravens and the Steelers, and I don't think the Steelers are going to be as good this year. And the Browns, I know Watson's suspended for 11 games, so that's going to hurt them a lot. But like, really, it's the Ravens. So I started looking at their schedule, and one thing that's really interesting is they play the Ravens in the final week of the season. I could potentially see that game meaning a lot for both of these teams or one of these teams, where it's like they have to win to make the playoffs. So I think that the Bengals, it's not going to be an easy road to get back to the playoffs. I think if they do get back to the playoffs, I mean, they're going to have their work. Anyone in the AFC is going to have their work cut out for them. It doesn't matter if you're the Bills. It doesn't matter if you're the Chiefs. People are super hyped about the Chargers, right? It doesn't really matter because every team in the playoffs is going to be a legit team. So I think that the road back to the Super Bowl is extremely hard, but the road back to the playoffs even is a little bit tougher than you would imagine from a team that was just in the Super Bowl.
Yeah, and I look at this team and they're going to start off the season strong. They have a very easy early schedule. The last, 5-6 games is maybe the hardest final 6 games I've ever seen from a schedule. Okay. They go Kansas City at home to Cleveland, which is a rivalry. Deshaun Watson will be back at that point, so it will be a difficult game. Then they go at Tampa Bay, at New England, home against the Buffalo Bills, and then they play against the Baltimore Ravens at home. Those are all contenders. And I think the Cleveland Browns, if they have Deshaun Watson, are a contender in the NFL. They won't be a contender this year, but with Watson, they're a very good team and difficult to beat. That right there is enough to knock you off your rocker. And not to mention, the week before that, against the Kansas City Chiefs, they're playing the Titans. The week before that, they're playing at Pittsburgh. I mean, the way that they have to finish this season is like, okay, they need to beat all playoff teams, or teams that would be in the playoffs if they didn't have suspensions. And then they got to figure out, okay, because they're not going to be the number 1 seed in the AFC. I know that for a fact. Other teams just have easier schedules. So they're going to have to do all of that. And then they would have to get on their horse and be like, okay, now we have to play in the wild card round. And it's very unlikely that the wild card, based on the rosters that we have in the AFC now, the Raiders in the wild card round, very different team. Because they've added, guys like Devontae Adams. Oh, maybe play the Chargers in the wild card round. Oh, that's not easy either because they added Khalil Mack and J.C. Jackson. Maybe you play against the Colts, and it's like, okay, the Colts maybe aren't that great. But at the same time, they're going to pound that rock with Jonathan Taylor with the best offensive line in the NFL. They have good weapons, and they have a really solid defense. The road will be so much harder for them. Obviously there could be injuries for other teams and stuff like that, but how it looks like it's shaping up, I don't see them as a contender in the NFL. I don't think they're winning their division. They won 9 games last year. And you may look at it like, oh yeah, they made it to the Super Bowl. They only won 9 games. And you look at the games that they won, they're impressive, but a lot of them are very close. They beat the Vikings in week 1. Vikings started off the season very poorly. They beat the Steelers.
They won 10. They won 10.
Sorry.
10.
Yeah, they won 10. I know they won 2 games more than the Ravens did. And the Ravens, I guess, won 8. They beat the Jaguars. They beat the Detroit Lions. They beat the Ravens without Lamar Jackson. They lost to the Jets. They lost to the Browns. They lost to the Browns again. So they beat the Broncos. The teams that they were playing are not the teams that they will be facing this season. It's such a harder schedule, not just in the playoffs, but in the regular season. And they win all of their games. It's like, okay, when they win, it's because all cylinders are clicking in the offense, which, that can happen any week. But there are plenty of games where that defense just struggles. Struggles horribly. They allowed 34 to the Jets. They allowed Baker and the Browns to put up 41. They allowed, I guess, the Chiefs isn't a bad offense, but they allowed over 30 to the Chiefs. They allowed the Bears to put up 20 on them. And it's like, oh yeah, they only allowed 20. It's to the Bears. It was Justin Fields' second game. This defense isn't that good. The offense is very explosive, but when you have to rely on these, there's only one quarterback in the NFL. I'll say 2 quarterbacks. I'll say Brady and Russell Wilson, where you can be like, it's okay if every game that they play is a 1-possession game because they'll win them. The Bengals, it seems like the majority of their wins are these very tight matchups that come down to the wire. And I like Joe Burrow. He can definitely win those matchups, but he's not Russell Wilson or Tom Brady. And we'll get into that later, but
I like it. I think that what you're saying is super fair. I just think that I'm a little bit higher on their chances to make the playoffs than you are, but I still think I think it's closer to 50-50 than people put it. That's what I think. I know you think that it's probably more likely than not that they don't make the playoffs, but I think most people think it's going to be like they're a shoo-in to make the playoffs. And I don't feel that way at all. And you look at you brought up the schedule too, but also look at some of those teams that you brought up. Some of those teams have even gotten better. The Broncos got better. The Chargers got better. The Bills got better. A lot of these teams are way better. Now there's a few that that downgraded, the Chiefs, the Titans, the Steelers. But I think Steelers will probably be pretty similar. Big Ben was terrible last year. But yeah, so I don't know. That's where I'm at on the overall in the Bengals. I think that more likely than not, they will make the playoffs, but I think it's pretty close. And I would not be surprised at all if they are not in. I think they're kind of fighting for one of those wild card spots, which I think most people probably think they're going to win the division. So I do not believe that.
Yeah, this road is going to be so much more difficult than it has been, or than it was last year, because I mean they're going to be looking in at it, I think, just like the Colts were last year. That's my expectation. Maybe they're in it to the end, but like they're just not going to be able to get there. Just like the Chargers were, where it's like, oh yeah, they're talented and they have offensive performance. I think they're going to be very similar to the Chargers last year, where it's like great explosive offense. The quarterback is he's playing great football, just like we saw out of Justin Herbert. But at the same time, the defense is allowing too many points. There's going to be too many situations where Burrow doesn't get to have the ball at the end. And teams are going to move down the field. And they're going to put up those final drives. And they're going to get those last points. Evan McPherson won't have as many opportunities for game-winning field goals because teams will be like, hey, let's manage the clock a little bit better. Because a lot of times rookie quarterbacks, teams won't necessarily be like, okay, we need to manage the clock. Don't let them get the ball. Because they're like, I don't think this rookie can do it. And Joe Burrow, I know he wasn't a rookie last year, but he's a pseudo rookie because he didn't play his whole rookie year. I think teams are now like, okay, we don't want Joe Burrow, game on the line, ball in his hands. So let's manage it a little bit better, take it down to a little bit less time, maybe kick the field goal rather than, going all in right away. So I don't see them making the playoffs. I think they win about 9 games. And I don't think 9 games gets you to the wild card this year. And tiebreakers, teams in the AFC West, you're going to look at their strength of schedule. It's going to be very high. Why? Because they played 3 AFC West teams. Like, if they're tied with the Raiders or the Chargers, they don't play them. And the Chargers and Raiders are going to be able to say, hey, we played the Chiefs twice. We played the Chargers or the Raiders twice. We played the Broncos twice. That right there is a lot higher than being like, oh, well, we played the Browns, which won't have a very good record because no Deshaun Watson. And, oh, we played the Jets. And, oh, we played the Miami Dolphins. I just don't see it happening. Unless, obviously, there's injuries to other teams and stuff like that where it could happen. But even if they make it to the playoffs, I just don't see them getting a schedule that's so favorable to them. Because a lot of people will be like, oh, well, you're only saying that because they made it to the Super Bowl. No, we talked about this before the playoffs even started. Matt and I had talked about this. I predicted every game of the playoffs and predicted the Bengals to make it to the Super Bowl. Why? Because the path was set up so perfectly. So perfectly. And then they got a terrible matchup against the Rams. And the Rams capitalized. And they were like, no, we're going to have Aaron Donald. And Aaron Donald is going to win this football game.